A flight attendant pulled a man out of his first-class seat in front of every passenger on the plane, publicly, deliberately, without hesitation. She questioned his ticket, doubted his right to be there, and walked him down the aisle to a middle seat in economy, like he was someone who had wandered into the wrong life. The entire cabin watched and said nothing. Nobody pushed back. Nobody asked a single question. But what none of them knew, not the attendant, not the celebrity who took his seat, not one silent passenger was that. 60 seconds after he sat down, a single text message from that man's phone grounded the entire aircraft. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart at 6:45 in the evening, and by 6:20, most of the first-class cabin was already settled. Bags were stowed, jackets folded, drinks ordered. The kind of quiet that comes before a long flight, comfortable rehearsed, slightly self-satisfied. Seat 2A sat near the window on the left side of the cabin, slightly apart from the cluster of business travelers who were already opening laptops and checking watches. The man in that seat wasn't doing either of those things. Elliot Carter looked exactly like someone who had grabbed whatever was clean off the back of a chair that morning. Gray jacket, the kind that had been washed so many times the shoulders had gone soft. A leather backpack with a scuff across the front panel that he had never bothered to get repaired. The laptop on his tray table was functional. Not new, the corner of the casing had a crack, taped over with a strip of black electrical tape. He wasn't reading anything important. He wasn't on a call. He was staring at the tarmac through the oval window with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to find silence wherever he could get it. He had been in New York for 4 days. Back-to-back meetings with the executive board, a contract renegotiation that had dragged 2 days past its scheduled close, and one dinner he had endured for the sake of a partnership that hadn't fully materialized yet. He was 41 years old, a single father, and he was tired in the way that goes deeper than sleep, the kind of tired that builds up across years, not nights. The flight back to Los Angeles was supposed to give him a few hours of nothing, just air, just distance from the noise. He had run Skybridge Airways for 6 years, not as a figurehead as the person who had rebuilt it from the bottom after the previous ownership had nearly run it into the ground. Most people inside the company knew the name. Very few knew the face. He had made that choice deliberately early on, when he realized that anonymity let him see things more clearly, the way a business actually ran when no one was performing for the boss. He flew his own airline the same way he ran it, without announcement, without ceremony, and usually without anyone noticing he was there at all. Vanessa Cole had been a head flight attendant for Skybridge for 11 years. She had the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the first-class cabin was her domain, and she moved through it with the particular authority of a person who had never seriously been challenged. She was efficient, polished, and effective, and she operated on a clear internal hierarchy that had nothing to do with the official seating chart. The passengers she paid attention to were the ones who looked the part. Tailored suits, luggage with the right logos, the easy confidence of people who traveled like this every week and never thought twice about it. The passengers she tolerated were everyone else. She had noticed Elliot the moment he boarded. Not because he had done anything wrong, he hadn't. He was in the correct seat, had his boarding pass ready, said nothing out of place. But he didn't fit the picture she carried in her head of who belonged in row 2. And that small discrepancy had lodged itself in the back of her attention like a splinter. She said nothing at first. She moved through the cabin, greeted the passengers. She recognized, confirmed drink orders, and kept one eye on seat 2A. The situation changed at 6:38, when the gate agent's voice came through the crew intercom, a late addition to the manifest, a passenger connecting from a delayed international flight requesting accommodation. The name the agent gave was Damian Sterling. It was the kind of name that changed the air in a room. Sterling was one of the most recognizable actors in the country, the kind of famous that required no explanation and no context. He had been on 3 magazine covers in the past 6 months, and his last film had opened at #1 for 4 consecutive weekends. When he appeared at the cabin door 2 minutes later, tall, unhurried, wearing sunglasses, he hadn't bothered to take off the shift, and the cabin's energy was immediate and physical. Heads turned. A woman near the back of first class straightened in her seat. The man across the aisle from Elliot made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Vanessa was at the door before Sterling had taken 3 steps. She welcomed him with the kind of warmth she had not extended to most of the other passengers. And then she did what she always did. When an equation didn't add up, she looked for the weakest variable and began working out how to remove it. First class was full. Every seat on the manifest was confirmed and paid. There was no open seat to offer. She looked down the cabin once, then again, and her eyes came back to row 2, to the gray jacket, to the beaten backpack in the overhead bin, to the man with the cracked laptop who still hadn't ordered a drink. She walked down the aisle and stood at the edge of Elliot's row with her hands folded in front of her. Her voice was professional, measured the kind of tone that delivers an insult without ever technically saying one. "Sir, I'm going to need to take a look at your boarding documentation." Elliot looked up from the window. He registered the expression on her face and what it meant, and something in him settled into a kind of patient stillness. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack and handed her his boarding pass without a word. Vanessa studied it for longer than necessary. She turned it over. She looked at the seat number, then at him, then back at the pass. "And you have a booking confirmation, something from the system." He pulled out his phone and opened the confirmation email sent 3 weeks prior. Seat 2A, first class, New York to Los Angeles round trip. He held the screen toward her. She looked at it. Her expression didn't change. "There may be a system discrepancy," she said. "We've had some ticketing issues on this route recently. I'm going to need to verify this with the gate." Elliot kept his voice level. "The ticket is valid. The confirmation number is right there. There's no discrepancy." "I understand your concern," she said, in the way people say it when they don't. "But I need to verify before we can proceed." She had already begun glancing back toward the front of the cabin, toward Sterling, who was standing near the galley looking at his phone. The calculation she had made was obvious to anyone paying attention, and in a cabin that small, everyone was paying attention. She came back 2 minutes later with nothing new. No gate agent, no second confirmation, no resolution from any actual system check. What she came back with was a decision that had already been made before she left. She stood at the end of his row and told him in a voice just loud enough for the rows around him to hear that there appeared to be a conflict with his seat assignment, and that the airline would need to relocate him to available seating in the main cabin while the issue was resolved. Elliot looked at her directly. "What seat are you offering?" "We have a center seat available in row 26. You'll be comfortable there, and we'll look into the ticket situation once we're airborne. Row 26 center. The middle seat of a 3-seat configuration between 2 strangers for a 5.5-hour flight after 4 days in New York and a meeting the following morning at 8. He understood what was happening. He had understood it from the moment she first appeared at his row, but he had wanted to give the process a chance to correct itself the way he always did, because he had learned that sometimes people surprised you. They did not always surprise you. He asked calmly to speak with the ground operations manager or the captain. It was a reasonable request. It was the correct next step under any legitimate ticketing dispute. Vanessa talked over him before he finished the sentence, her voice tightening slightly around the edges in a way that was not quite professional anymore. She said that escalating the situation at this stage would delay departure for every passenger on the flight, and that if he continued to refuse to comply, she would have no choice but to involve airport security. The word security did what it was designed to do. Several passengers, who had been watching with neutral expressions, shifted slightly. A man in a suit near the front turned away, as if the scene had stopped being interesting. A woman 2 rows back looked down at her magazine. Nobody said anything. Not one person in that cabin raised a hand or opened their mouth or indicated in any way that what they were watching was wrong. Some of them had heard the whole exchange. Some of them had watched Vanessa study his ticket with exaggerated suspicion and then return with a decision that had nothing to do with any ticketing system. And they said nothing because the flight was already running behind, and Damien Sterling was standing 10 feet away, and the quiet arithmetic of the moment pointed toward a much easier outcome than the truth. Elliot picked up his laptop and closed it. He reached up and pulled his backpack from the overhead bin. The cabin was absolutely still. Not the comfortable stillness of before, but the held-breath stillness of a room that knows it is doing something it will not be proud of later and is choosing to do it anyway. He walked the length of the aisle from the front of the plane to row 26, and no one looked at him as he passed. Damien Sterling, to his credit, did not look up either, but he also did not say a word. The center seat was exactly what it was. Narrow flanked on both sides, positioned where you could feel the full weight of every hour. Elliot settled into it and set his backpack on his knees. The overhead bin above him was already full. He didn't try to find space. He sat there for a moment in the particular silence of a person who has decided not to react, not out of weakness and not out of resignation, but out of the kind of deliberate control that takes much longer to develop than anger. He thought about the morning meeting. He thought about the contract that was still open. He thought about what he had seen in that cabin in the past 15 minutes, not just Vanessa, but the rows of people who had watched and calculated and turned away. Then he took out his phone, opened a message thread with his executive assistant, and typed 7 words. "Hold the aircraft." He sent it and put the phone face down on his knee. Around him, passengers were settling in for a routine flight. The engines had begun their low preliminary hum. Somewhere up front, Vanessa Cole was probably accepting a compliment she had not earned from a man who did not know what had just been done on his behalf. Elliot stared at the seat back in front of him and waited. Vanessa Cole had a particular way of moving through the cabin after a problem was resolved, unhurried, composed with just enough visibility to let everyone register that the situation had been handled. She moved that way, now stopping briefly near the galley to straighten a service cart that didn't need straightening, then proceeding up the aisle with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done what needed to be done. Damien Sterling was in seat, 2A jacket off water, already in hand. He had thanked her when she showed him to the seat briefly, easily, the way people thank someone for doing exactly what they expected. It was the kind of acknowledgement that confirmed everything she believed about how the system was supposed to work. The first-class cabin had returned to its pre-boarding stillness. The passengers who had watched the exchange with Elliot had rearranged themselves back into their own concerns. Drinks, screens, the particular self-containment of people who had decided that what they witnessed was not their business. A few of them had exchanged glances when Sterling was seated. Not uncomfortable glances. The other kind, the quiet, satisfied consensus that the situation had resolved in the direction that made sense. The man in the gray jacket had not seemed to belong there. The man currently in seat 2A very clearly did. The math from where they were sitting was straightforward. Ryan had not found the math so straightforward. He was 26 in his second year with Skybridge, and he had been near the rear galley when Vanessa walked Elliot down the aisle. He had seen the boarding pass. He had been close enough to read the confirmation email on Elliot's phone screen seat, 2A first class, booked 3 weeks prior. He had also seen Vanessa's expression when she came back from her supposed system check, and he recognized it for what it was. Not the expression of someone who had discovered a discrepancy, but of someone who had made a decision and was now constructing the justification for it in real time. He had thought about saying something. The thought had been clear and specific. He could walk up, ask to see the documentation himself, redirect the conversation toward a ground supervisor. It was within his authority as crew. It was also, in practical terms, a direct challenge to a head flight attendant who had 11 years with the airline and a reputation for remembering exactly who had crossed her and how. Ryan had stood in the rear galley and watched Elliot carry his backpack to row 26, and he had said nothing, and that silence was still sitting in his chest like something he had swallowed wrong. In seat 26, Elliot was doing the thing he had trained himself to do in situations that required patience, he was observing. The passengers around him in economy had not witnessed the first-class exchange, and had no particular feelings about him, one way or another. The man on his left had fallen asleep before the boarding door closed. The woman on his right was watching something on her tablet with headphones in. The ordinary, unremarkable texture of a full flight in economy, a thing Elliot had observed dozens of times, usually from a different angle. He was aware in a way that had nothing to do with ego, that he was sitting in a section of a plane that his own decisions had shaped. The seats spacing the ventilation and the ratio of lavatories to passengers. He had reviewed those specs in a conference room 8 months ago and signed off on changes that would take effect in the next fleet update. He thought about that now, not with irony, but with the specific attention of someone cataloging a gap between intention and reality. His phone had not yet registered a response from his executive assistant. That wasn't unusual. She moved fast when she needed to, and didn't narrate her process while she was in it. He knew the message would reach the right person quickly. It always did. The chain was short, and the people in it understood what 7 words from that particular number meant. He put the phone back on his knee and watched the runway through the small window above the sleeping man's shoulder. The engines had reached their boarding complete hum when the change happened, not gradual, immediate, the kind of shift you feel before you understand it, like a pressure change in a room. The jet bridge, which had already been retracted, was moving back toward the aircraft. Through the oval windows on the left side of the plane, passengers could see a vehicle on the tarmac that had not been there a minute ago. A ground crew radio transmission came through the cockpit, muffled, brief, not repeated. And then the boarding door opened again. The reaction in the cabin was instinctive and confused. Passengers pulled out earbuds. A man in a middle seat near the front half stood to look over the headrests. The woman with the tablet lowered it. In first class, Vanessa had already started moving toward the door, not because she had been called, but because when something unexpected happened on her aircraft, she made it her business to be at the front of it. She got there just as the door finished opening. What came through it was not a single person, but a group 4 of them moving with the purposeful compactness of people who had somewhere specific to be. 2 were airport operations staff in ground crew vests. One was a man Vanessa didn't recognize carrying a tablet and walking slightly behind the others, and at the front was Amelia Brooks. Vanessa knew Amelia by name and by title, Senior Vice President of Operations. She had seen her photograph in internal communications. She had never been in a room with her. In person, Amelia moved like someone who had long ago stopped worrying about whether the room was ready for her. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a dark blazer over a gray shirt, her hair pulled back cleanly. She did not make eye contact with Vanessa as she came through the door. She scanned the first-class cabin once the way you scan a room when you already know what you're looking for isn't there. And then she walked. She walked past the first-class galley, past the divider curtain, down the main cabin aisle past row after row of passengers who had gone completely silent, past the man who had half stood and had now fully sat back down, past the overhead bins and the recirculated air and the particular stillness of 212 people who understood that something had just broken from the routine in a way that did not have an obvious explanation. She walked until she reached row 26. She stopped at the end of the row. She looked at Elliot backpack still on his knees phone, face down sitting in the center seat between a sleeping man and a woman who had removed her headphones to watch what was unfolding. Amelia's voice was even professional and completely audible to the 8 rows around her. "Mr. Carter, the board is waiting on your meeting." The silence that followed was not dramatic. In the way silences are sometimes described, it wasn't charged, or electric, or suspended. It was the specific flat silence of a very large number of people recalibrating simultaneously. The woman with the tablet looked from Amelia to Elliot and back. The man across the aisle had his mouth slightly open, and the rows behind passengers were leaning forward with the unconscious reflex of people trying to hear something better. Vanessa had followed Amelia down the aisle at a distance, and she was standing 5 rows back when she heard it. She watched Elliot rise from the center seat, unhurried the same way he had sat down in it, and she watched Amelia step aside to give him room in the aisle. Then Amelia turned and looked directly at her for the first time since boarding. "This is Elliot Carter," Amelia said to Vanessa and to every passenger within earshot. CEO of Skybridge Airways. What happened next was not a scene. There was no gasp, no dramatic reaction from the cabin. What happened was quieter and in many ways worse than a scene. It was the specific discomfort of a very large number of people realizing at the same moment what they had watched happen and what they had chosen to do about it. Vanessa opened her mouth. What came out was the sentence she reached for when the ground shifted, controlled, measured the professional fallback. "I was following standard procedure for a ticketing discrepancy. The system indicated tabosom." Amelia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The system indicated a confirmed first-class booking in seat 2A made 3 weeks ago. I have the full record here." She half-turned to the man with the tablet who had come to stand just behind her right shoulder. He turned the screen outward. The booking confirmation was visible: seat number, purchase date, passenger name. Clear and inarguable. Vanessa looked at the screen. She did not say anything. The captain had come out of the cockpit at some point during this. Elliot hadn't registered exactly when, but he was standing at the front of the main cabin now, near the divider, with the expression of a man understanding the difference between what he had been told and what had actually been true. He had been in the cockpit during the original exchange, and he had received Vanessa's brief professional summary. A ticketing irregularity, a passenger relocated situation resolved, ready for departure. He had accepted that summary because Vanessa had been doing this for 11 years, and he had no particular reason to doubt her. He understood now what that acceptance had meant, and the understanding was not comfortable. Damian Sterling had been watching from his seat in first class. He hadn't moved. From where he sat, he had a partial view down the main cabin aisle, enough to see the group around row 26, and to hear most of what was being said. The pieces had assembled themselves quickly. The man in the gray jacket, the center seat. The 7 words that had grounded the aircraft. The CEO. Sterling was 43 years old and had been famous long enough to have developed at some point a clear-eyed understanding of the way his presence changed rooms. He had understood it when Vanessa walked him to seat 2A. He had understood in a removed and self-protective way that the seat had become available because of someone else. He had chosen not to examine that too closely because the flight was already delayed, and the seat was right there, and someone else would sort out the details. He saw now what the details had been. He said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. He had quite a lot actually running through his head with increasing precision, but because there was nothing he could say in that moment that would not sound like what it was, a famous person explaining why he had let someone else absorb the cost of his convenience. Elliot stood in the aisle. He was aware of the eyes on him, all of them first class and main cabin, both the passengers and crew and the captain at the front, and Vanessa 4 rows back. He did not look around the cabin the way someone looks around when they want to be seen. He was aware of the weight of it, not the weight of being recognized, but the weight of everything he had watched happen in the past 40 minutes, being publicly and irrevocably named for what it was. There was no satisfaction in it. Satisfaction would have required that the outcome surprised him, and it hadn't. What it had confirmed was the thing he had suspected and had hoped quietly and without much expectation was not as bad as it seemed. It was exactly as bad as it seemed. Amelia spoke again, still at the same volume, still without inflection. She looked at Vanessa and said that effective immediately pending a full internal review, Vanessa was relieved of duty for the duration of the flight. Ground operations would coordinate with the crew. Her access credentials and boarding authority would be suspended until further notice. The words landed in the cabin with a dull, factual weight. This was not a dramatic firing. There was no theatrical confrontation, no raised voice, no moment designed for the room. It was administrative and correct and devastating in the way that real consequences usually are, which is quietly in front of everyone, with no score underneath it. Vanessa removed her name badge from her uniform lapel. It was a small motion, the kind of thing fingers do when the mind hasn't fully arrived yet. She held it for a moment, the laminated card with the Skybridge logo, and her name, and her 11 years of seniority compressed into a 2-inch rectangle. Then she handed it to the operations staff member, standing beside Amelia, and turned toward the front of the plane. She did not look at Elliot as she passed him. She did not look at the passengers. She walked out of the aircraft with the particular composure of someone who has decided in real time that composure is the only thing left available to them. The boarding door closed again behind the operations staff. The jet bridge retracted for the second time. In the cabin, nobody spoke for a moment that stretched just past comfortable. Then somewhere in the middle, rows, someone coughed. A passenger near the back asked their seatmate something in a low voice. The ordinary sounds of a plane that was about to become a flight again began to reassemble themselves from the silence. Elliot looked at Amelia and said quietly and without drama that he wanted a full audit of crew conduct protocols on this route. Not just this crew. The route. The patterns. Amelia nodded once. Already scheduled. He looked toward the front of the plane where the captain was still standing. The captain met his gaze directly. No evasion, just the uncomfortable clarity of a person doing the work of accounting for something they had gotten wrong. Elliot gave him a brief level nod. Then he looked back at row 26 at the center seat at the backpack he had left on the floor, between the seats, because the overhead bin was full. He picked it up and followed Amelia back up the aisle toward first class. The passengers he passed did not avert their eyes this time. They watched him not with the detached, self-protective neutrality of before, but with the specific, unresolved discomfort of people who had been shown a mirror and were still deciding what to do with what they saw in it. The aircraft lifted off 47 minutes behind schedule, below the lights of New York spread outward in every direction, and then gave way to the dark of the Atlantic coastline, and then to nothing visible at all. The cabin settled into the particular rhythm of a long flight, finally underway, the seatbelt sign clicking off the quiet shuffle of passengers reaching for blankets and headphones, and the small, private arrangements people make when they accept that they will be suspended at 37,000 feet for the next several hours with no way out and nothing to do but wait. The atmosphere in the cabin was not the same as before. It had the same physical components, the same recycled air, the same ambient engine, the same rows of seats arranged in the same configuration, but the texture of it had changed in a way that was difficult to name precisely and impossible to ignore. The passengers who had watched Amelia Brooks walk down the aisle to row 26, and who had then watched Elliot walk back up it, and who had then watched Vanessa Cole hand over her name badge and leave the aircraft, those passengers were not at ease. They were doing the things you do on a long flight, but they were doing them with the specific self-consciousness of people who have recently been shown something about themselves and have not yet decided what to do with it. In seat 2, A. Elliot had his laptop open. The cracked corner of the casing caught the overhead light the same way it always did. He was not looking at the screen. He was looking at the seat back in front of him with the focused inattention of someone whose mind is somewhere else, entirely working through something that has no clean resolution and is not going to find one on this flight. The thing that stayed with him, the thing he couldn't organize into a column or a decision or a next step, was not Vanessa. He had seen versions of Vanessa before. He would see versions of her again. What stayed with him was the cabin. The full, silent, watching cabin, row after row of people who had seen exactly what was happening and had calculated each in their own way that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of watching. And then the plane had taken off, and that calculation had simply moved forward with them, unexamined, at 570 miles per hour. Amelia was seated 2 rows behind him, working from her own laptop, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already moved to the next problem. She had said very little since they reboarded, which was not unusual for her, and which Elliot took as a form of professional respect. She understood that what had happened on the tarmac was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a longer, less visible piece of work, and she was already in it. Ryan came forward from the rear galley about 90 minutes into the flight. He had a water and a set of headphones to return to a passenger 2 rows up, and he could have handled the errand and gone back without stopping. He didn't. He stopped at the edge of Elliot's row, holding the water with both hands, in the careful way people hold things when they are using the object as an anchor, and he said, without any preamble or softening, that he owed Mr. Carter an apology. Elliot looked up from the seat back he had been staring at. Ryan kept going, because he had clearly decided that stopping partway through would be worse than finishing. He said he had seen the boarding pass. He said he had been close enough to read the confirmation on the phone screen, and he had known, not suspected known, that what Vanessa was doing did not correspond to any actual ticketing problem. He said he had thought about intervening, and had chosen not to, and that the reason he had chosen not to had nothing to do with uncertainty about what was right, and everything to do with what was convenient and safe for him personally. He said he was sorry, and he said it in the flat, undecorated way of someone who has decided that an apology without explanation is more honest than one with. Elliot studied him for a moment. There was something in the young man's face that was worth paying attention to. Not guilt exactly, which tends to be self-referential, but something closer to accountability, which looks outward. The distinction mattered to Elliot more than he could have easily explained. He told Ryan evenly that he appreciated the honesty. He meant it. He also told him that the apology, while accepted, was the easier part, that the harder part was understanding why the calculation had gone the way it did, so that the next time a similar moment arrived, the math would come out differently. Ryan nodded in the way people nod when they are genuinely listening, rather than waiting for permission to stop listening. Then he excused himself and went back to the galley. Damian Sterling had been quiet since the aircraft leveled off. He had declined the meal service accepted water and spent most of the flight looking at his phone, without any visible sign that he was registering what was on it. He was not a person accustomed to discomfort of this particular variety, the kind that has no external cause. You can point to no obstacle you can address or press or negotiate around. The discomfort he was sitting with was entirely internal, which made it the most stubborn kind. About 2 hours in, he stood from his seat, stretched once, and then walked back down the main cabin aisle in the way that famous people walk through public spaces, with the slight extra stillness that comes from years of being watched and learning to move as though you aren't aware of it. He stopped at row 2 and looked at Elliot, who looked back at him without expression. Sterling said that he didn't have a clean way to say what he wanted to say, so he was going to say it plainly. He said he had known when he sat down in that seat that the situation didn't fully add up, that a head flight attendant doesn't walk a confirmed first-class passenger to economy over a real ticketing error, that real ticketing errors get resolved at the gate, not mid-boarding. He said he had let himself accept the seat anyway, because it was easier, and because he was tired, and because he had told himself it was someone else's problem to sort out. He said that was not an excuse. He said he was sorry. Elliot listened to all of it. When Sterling finished, Elliot told him that he believed him, and that the honesty was worth something. What he didn't say, because it wasn't the right moment for it, and because some things are better left for people to work out on their own, was that being sorry was the beginning of the work, not the end of it. Sterling seemed to understand that anyway, in the partial, unresolved way that most genuine reckonings begin. He nodded, once returned to his seat, and didn't speak again for the rest of the flight. Elliot closed his laptop around the 3-hour mark and sat with his thoughts in the dark of the cabin. Around him, most passengers had settled into sleep or the particular suspended state that long flights produce, not quite one thing or the other, just the passage of time at altitude. He was thinking about the program that had already started forming in his mind, sometime around the 2nd hour, somewhere over the middle of the country. Not a disciplinary response that was already in motion, and Amelia would handle the mechanisms of it with characteristic precision. Something larger than that. Something that addressed not just what one flight attendant had done, but what the entire cabin had permitted, and what the culture of the airline had quietly made possible. The investigation that Elliot launched in the weeks following the flight was thorough and deliberately unglamorous. It was not designed to produce headlines or signal virtue. It was designed to find the actual patterns, which are always more instructive and more uncomfortable than the individual incidents that surface them. The review team interviewed crew members across multiple routes, examined complaint records that had been filed and not followed up on, and identified a set of structural habits in how certain staff assessed and treated passengers that had been visible in the data for some time and had not been acted upon. Vanessa's termination was processed formally and without drama, the way terminations should be when the grounds are clear. What had happened on the flight was documented in full: the unjustified seat relocation, the fabricated system discrepancy, the misuse of security threat language to silence a legitimate complaint. The record was complete and unambiguous. She did not contest it. Whatever she had told herself about the event in the hours and days after, she knew what the documentation showed because she had been there for all of it. The captain received a different outcome. He had not acted in bad faith. He had acted on incomplete information, accepted a subordinate's account without verification, and allowed a situation to proceed that he had the authority to halt. That was a failure of leadership rather than a failure of character, and Elliot treated it as such. The captain was enrolled in a mandatory retraining program focused on command responsibility and the specific dynamics of how authority gets misused by people further down a chain when those at the top are not actively looking. It wasn't a punitive program. It was a practical one. The distinction to Elliot was important. Ryan received a different outcome still. Elliot had asked Amelia to pull his personnel file after the flight, and what he found there was consistent with what he had observed in that brief conversation at row 2. A junior employee with good instincts and the beginnings of real judgment, who was currently working in an environment that rewarded silence over integrity, and had not yet given him a compelling reason to choose differently. Elliot enrolled him in Skybridge's management development program directly, which bypassed the standard application process. He sent a brief note explaining the decision that the ability to recognize a mistake and name it honestly, without prompting, and without the protection of any authority, was the quality he looked for most and found least. The broader initiative took longer to build, but moved with the kind of quiet momentum that happens when the person driving it has both the authority and the genuine interest to see it through. The program was called Every Seat Has a Story. It was not a marketing campaign. It did not appear in the airline's public communications or in any of the window seat advertising that Elliot had always found slightly dishonest. It was an internal initiative, embedded into the onboarding and ongoing training of every cabin crew member across the Skybridge fleet, built around a single foundational idea that a person's worth is not visible. That the man in the worn jacket and the woman in the business suit and the passenger in row 26 are not narratives you can read from the outside, and that the job of crew is not to assess who belongs where, but to ensure that every person who boards feels without exception that they do. The training was specific and practical. It used real scenarios, not invented ones, but documented cases from actual flights, with identifying details removed where crew had made assumptions that were demonstrably wrong and where passengers had been treated in ways that could not be defended by any legitimate interpretation of procedure. The cases were not presented as cautionary tales about extreme behavior. They were presented as examples of ordinary, incremental failures. The small decisions made quickly under pressure in the presence of social incentives that pointed toward the wrong outcome. The argument the training made was not that people were bad. It was that systems produce behavior, and that the system had been producing the wrong behavior for long enough that it had started to seem like the normal kind. Several months after the flight on a Tuesday morning at O'Hare, a passenger boarded a Skybridge flight bound for Denver. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, in a flannel shirt and work pants, carrying a duffel bag that had seen better years. His first-class boarding pass was legitimate, purchased 6 weeks earlier, for a price that had been reasonable at the time of purchase. He moved through the jet bridge at the unhurried pace of someone who was not performing anything for anyone, found his seat in the third row, and tucked his duffel under the seat in front of him, because it didn't quite fit in the overhead bin without forcing it. A flight attendant appeared at the end of his row. She was new 7 months, with Skybridge still in the phase of the job where everything is slightly more vivid than it will eventually become. She looked at him, and there was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where her eyes registered the flannel shirt and the worn duffel and moved toward an assessment she had been trained very specifically not to complete. The moment lasted less than a second. She remembered the case study from her 3rd week of training, the gray jacket, the cracked laptop, the center seat at row 26. She remembered what the trainer had said at the end of that session, without drama and without decoration, that the story you tell yourself about a passenger in the first 3 seconds is almost always about you, not about them. She smiled, not the practiced, distance-maintaining smile of rote service, but the actual kind, the one that reaches the eyes and means something. And she asked if she could bring him anything before departure. The man looked up. He said a coffee would be great. Black, no sugar, if it wasn't too much trouble. She told him it was no trouble at all, and she meant it. And she went to get it. Nobody in the cabin noticed. There was no moment to mark. The flight boarded the door, closed. The plane pushed back from the gate on time, and everything proceeded the way things proceed, when they are going exactly the way they should, without friction, without incident, without anyone needing to intervene or correct or account for anything at all. The passenger drank his coffee. The flight attendant moved through the cabin. The aircraft climbed to altitude and leveled off, and outside the windows the flat middle of the country spread out below in every direction, enormous and indifferent the way it always does. And in a building on the 34th floor in Los Angeles, Elliot Carter sat in a conference room with 6 other people and worked through the second item on a very long agenda with no particular awareness that 700 miles away, in the 3rd row of a flight he had never heard of, something he had set in motion was working exactly the way he had hoped it would. That was what it looked like when a system changed. Not a scene, not an announcement. Just a person doing the right thing quietly because the conditions had finally been built to make it the easier choice.